the Forum for Philosophy. Welcome you all to this last lecture of the Wittgenstein's Tractatus lecture series. We had started this lecture series on 21st August 2021, and we have almost completed more than an year in this series. So today would be our last lecture by Professor Vikram Singh Sirola. A brief introduction about our speaker, Professor Sirola, is that he is one of the leading scholar in social epistemology. Um, he, in his early phase, worked on Tractatus, particularly early Wittgenstein, and later his interest is on history and philosophy of science and social epistemology in general. He was a Fulbright fellow, Nehru fellow, a senior Nehru, Fulbright senior Nehru fellow at Columbia University from 2010 to 2011, and um, he has many publications in the area of social epistemology, particularly in his recent um, essays are on underdetermination in science, evolutionary epistemology. Um, with this brief introduction, I welcome Professor Sirola to this forum. Uh, and the lecture will be chaired by Professor R.C. Pradhan. um, Professor Asif Pradhan has been chairing this lecture series entirely, so I welcome him to today's lecture. With this, um, I uh, invite Professor Sirola for lecture. We usually start with the lecture for um, about 40 minutes or so, 30 to 40 minutes, and then Professor Pradhan gives his observation, and then we open up for our discussion. Uh, so, over to Professor Sirola.
Okay, thank you, Professor Panda. Very good evening to all of the participants here in the forum meeting. Let me begin with the festival greetings to all of you. And I must say that I'm delighted to be invited uh, as one of the speakers of uh, by Professor Ranjan Panda under the auspices of Philosophy Forum. And it's a very successful series which he could organize for over 1 year. So I feel quite delighted to be part of it at the end of this series now. Uh, Now, as Professor Panda said, that I was working on Wittgenstein, and my most of the philosophical inspirations are drawn from the insights which I have gathered from Wittgenstein. So, though I work on certain areas on epistemology of science or social epistemology, but uh, there is a very clear linkages which I see, which motivate me to work on those issues. So today I'm speaking on the second part of the Tractatus, a view from the inside. This is the title, and it's a working paper, and certain major novel parts are yet to be written, but most of the parts right now are already there in certain publications, mostly with my student, former student, Manoranjan Malik. So it will be some of those ideas which I have developed a little more. So probably by the time we publish, it will be having more novelty and more developed ideas. So what is meant by the second part of the Tractatus? Let me just explain that first. Because most of the writings on Wittgenstein's ethics, they acknowledge this letter from Wittgenstein to Ludwig von Ficker. where he makes enigmatic statement about Tractatus, that the point of the book was an ethical one, and it consists of two parts. The one presented here, plus all that I have not written. Now, he's emphatic that the unwritten second part is the most important one. The importance of the unwritten gets elucidated in the subsequent statements in the letter when he says, "My book draws limits to the sphere of the ethical from the inside," which he is convinced is the only rigorous way of drawing those limits. So the book's success lies in putting everything firmly into place by being silent about it. So there is a lot of writings on Wittgenstein's firm uh, uh, idea on what we must be silent about. So I'm not going to go there much in this paper, and which is to do with the uh, proposal he has on the ineffable, the limits of language and what cannot be said. So this paper will revisit what Wittgenstein meant by drawing limits to ethics from the inside, and why can such limits not be drawn from without. Whether he succeeds in making the ethical point is coalesced with marking the realm of ineffable and drawing limits to thinking. Now, his attempt to highlight the limits of philosophical analysis is consonant with it. He shows how drawing limits to thinking from within is to draw limits not to thoughts themselves, but to their expression. One cannot think what cannot be thought, but a linguistic expression of thought may sometimes merely appear to express thoughts. Hence, carefully drawing limits to the expression of thoughts in language excludes certain expression from language which are nonsense. In other words, the description of the way everyday language functions puts forth the nonsensicality of the statements of ethics. The contentious proposal is that by saying clearly what can be said in the schema of language, philosophy attempts to show what lies on the other side of the limits of language, the realm of ineffable. That's why the distinction between what can be said and what cannot be said is critical to appreciate Wittgenstein's resolution to philosophical problems or the conceptual confusions. The ineffable, he believes, gets drawn by exhibiting clearly what can be said in language. Only by recognizing its significance, one would know why language cannot touch the essence of the world. Now, that's a kind of a brief exposure to those. Otherwise, there is a lot of writings and a lot of talks have already been done in this series on this issue. Now, I will bring to your notice one of the conversation Peter Haker had with Edward Cantarian, and I noted it in James Ponet's article, which is titled as "What Ethics in the Tractatus is Not." Now, it brings to notice the exchange between these two, where the question of centrality of ethical struggle in Wittgenstein's writing is being discussed. Now, Cantarian asks Hacker, Peter Hacker, do you think that his ethical struggle is of essential importance for our understanding of Wittgenstein as a philosopher? Hacker responds, no, I don't. I think that Wittgenstein, as a human being, was intensely, passionately concerned with moral questions, with how one should live, and with how he himself ought to live. But moral philosophy was a minor concern that preoccupied him only during one short phase of his philosophical career. Remember that he worked for 7 long years on the Tractatus. Only for a few months out of those 7 years was he concerned with ethical questions. During that phase in 1916, the ethical involvement is indeed deep and sincere. But to pretend that this is the main theme of the book seems to me to be wrong. Peter Haker says further that it is true that when he returned from the war, he told von Ficker that the book consists of two parts, the one he wrote and the the one that he didn't write, namely the absolute value. And the second is the more important one. He says, I do not doubt this sincerity, but I am inclined to question his judgment about his own achievement. The main achievement of the Tractatus consists in its insights into the nature of logic and criticisms of Frege and Russell, not in its remarks on ethics. Now, after the Tractatus, he wrote only one short piece of ethics, is indicating towards the lecture on ethics, the 1929 lecture, which is not very good. The idea that moral philosophy was at the center of Wittgenstein's philosophical concerns seems to me nonsense. Unquote. Now, the contentious question is whether Wittgenstein's ethical struggle is of essential importance for us to understand his philosophy. Now, definitely, a lot of writers on Wittgenstein disagreed with Hegel, and I also have my clear disagreement from Hegel's conclusion. And in this paper, I am arguing uh, those disagreements based on two claims. One, the moral philosophy which Hegel is looking for in Wittgenstein may not be a separable area of his philosophy in traditional sense. Rather, his concepts of ethics and value are to be seen as integrated with his concern on language, logic, and philosophy, especially in Tractatus. And the second is his attempt to draw the limits of language, the realm of ineffable, for him resolves not only the philosophical confusions, but also seeks to explore a transcendental character of self, the solipsistic self, which make the world and life ethically meaningful. Now, it is the second claim which is developed and argued here. Now, Wittgenstein's remark on the unwritten second part of the Tractatus, the more important one, helps in understanding how the real issues for Wittgenstein were always concerned with ethics and the world. And this he says in the preface clearly, where he had two major concerns in making the ethical point. One, what is the meaning of life? And two, how the world of contingent facts can have value. Now, he attempts to intertwine what is very personal to an individual with issues which are merely theoretical and philosophical. Equal emphasis is given to the life and the world. Life, which is purely personal and private, and the world, which is conceived as a series of events. His approach to ethics may be summed up in his response to Russell when Wittgenstein, who was lost in some deep thoughts, was asked by Russell, are you thinking about logic or about your sins? Wittgenstein's response was both. How he could think both at the same time? Is he stressing upon the point that both cannot be thought out separately? In other words, is he suggesting that one has to come to terms with life, with oneself, in addressing issues in logic and language? It is imperative to understand how the world of contingent facts can have value. Now, but before delving into it, it is imperative to make a brief note on the first concern, that is what Wittgenstein meant by meaning of life. His quest for meaningful life is not to be understood in terms of a search for its purpose or its functions. Why are we here and what are we supposed to be doing are not his interest, nor would he pose it in its usual form. That what is our destiny, where do we go from here, and where and how should we go. Meaning of life has nothing to do with the scientific explanation, whether physical, chemical, biological, historical, psychological, or sociological. It is simply what Wittgenstein says, the sense of the world. Purpose of life cannot be located anywhere except in living it. It is not necessarily a desire or aspiration for something in life or after it. It is a meaningful, it is meaningful. It is nothing more than that. That meaning lies in the will to live. So meaningful life is a will to live. Now, Wittgenstein is very cautious in acknowledging the relationship between ethics and the word. He says ethics does not treat the world. When he says ethics does not treat the world, ethics must be a condition of the world. This relation between the two, established by the subject or the I, which does not belong to the word, but it is its limit. So subject is not directly associated with the word, but it makes its appearance into the word through what Wittgenstein calls words being my word. Now, this brings the notion of metaphysical self at the center of Wittgenstein's contention of giving primacy to what is higher. It is imperative to explore metaphysical significance of self by redefining it as a philosophical self in contrast to psychological self. Now, Wittgenstein maintains this duality throughout his works, though he does not really rebuff the idea of seeing I or self as psychological or empirical, but calls attention to its another dimension. Transcendental features of self makes it possible to understand the possibilities of the world. By claiming that the world is my world, Wittgenstein commits to a solipsistic position, though such position would have severe limitations when analyzed in our material world of speech, but he recognizes and highlights the inherent merit in solipsist's point of view. In his attempt to bridge this apparent incompatibility, he undertakes as a philosophical journey from idealism to solipsism, and further from solipsism to realism. He propounds a unique notion of solipsism without a solipsistic self and tries to resolve this incompatibility by coinciding it with realism. Now, I find this is at the center of the whole proposal in understanding the second part and understanding what he meant by uh, uh, viewing it from the inside. Now, Wittgenstein's solipsistic position, I will elaborate a bit on that and then conclude with where we arrive in a position on ethics. The fundamental claim which solipsists make is that only I and my experiences are real. And they use the word real in an ordinary usage of language in contrast to unreal. Now, Wittgenstein agrees with traditional solipsist intent, but he finds their notion of self quite primordial. He says what the solipsist means is quite correct, only it cannot be said, but makes itself manifest. Disagreement is with the material mode of speech, where self is identified with the ego or person. In saying, I alone exist, or only my experiences are real, such sentences appear to have genuine negation. That is, they appear to allow that it is conceivable that there is something beyond immediate experience. Now, language is not conceivable if it does not represent this world. Names are given to objects in our immediate experiences, which can only be conceived of. Therefore, the very idea of things beyond immediate experience is delusion, as Wittgenstein says. So, solipsists fail in theorizing the a priori claim that I alone exist. Self as a combination of human body and soul, or as combination of human body and mind, does not attain the purpose for which the idea of self is philosophically introduced. So there really is a way in which there can and must be mention of I in a non-psychological sense in philosophy, as Wittgenstein believes. So he writes, the philosophical self is not the human being, not the human body, or the human soul, with psychology deals, but rather the metaphysical subject, the limit of the world, not a part of it, because the psychological would be a limit, would be a part of the world. In order to understand the higher order of the world and life from philosophical perspective, Wittgenstein makes place for a willing subject. He writes, all experience is world and does not need the subject, unquote. He further writes, I quote, the word is given me, that is, my will enters into the world completely from outside as into something that is already there, unquote. So, willing subject is to be distinguished from the psychological, thinking subject in order to appreciate Wittgenstein's ethical position. It may provide key to understand the journey Wittgenstein undertakes from idealism to solipsism and then to realism. This is the way I have traveled, he says. Idealism singles men out from the world as unique. Solipsism singles me alone out, and at last I see that I too belong with the rest of the world. And so, on the one side, nothing is left over, and the other side, as unique, the world. In this way, idealism leads to realism, if it is strictly thought out. Unquote. In saying that I am my word, what is asserted is that I cannot think or speak of anything beyond my immediate experiences. This word is accessible and conceivable to no one else except me. But it does not necessarily imply that my word is the only real word. Existence of others' word does not get denied here. Self and the limit of the word are intimately related with each other from the metaphysical point of view. Self creates its own word by viewing the word as a limited whole. The hard word gets reduced to a self's word, paving way for all to claim, I am my word, the microcosm, as Wittgenstein says. The word becomes identical with my word, where idea of the word is constituted only in terms of my experiences. It brings the self into philosophy, where I is the presupposition of the word. For Wittgenstein, the world cannot be conceived as possessing attributes. Those are psychophysical attributes, which are dependent on subjects experiencing them. So, subject is viewed here as the limits to the world, contrary to genuine solipsistic approach, which views itself as an experiencing object, a subject. Now, realism of Wittgenstein's position implies that there is only one word which reflects the totality of facts of which our language mirrors. There is only one language we all understand, which is publicly constructed. So, this uh, language defines the limits as logic pervades the world. As he says, limits of my language means limits of my world. There are two dimensions of the world that needs to be investigated. The world of which our language is a mirror image or logic is the condition, and my world, which belongs only to a metaphysical self. However, my world cannot exist if the hard world did not, as in such a case, there would be no reality for the metaphysical subject to coordinate with. Ontological relationships between self and the world is one where self makes its appearances in the world through the words being my world. Now, Wittgenstein concedes the importance of solipsist attempt to look at the world from the subject's own point of view. At the same time, he does not deny the possibility of others' existence, leading to a plurality of worlds. Now, such plurality of worlds would be based on individuals' own unique perspectives of and experiences in the world. Everyone can have their own unique experiences and attitudes in creating their own unique world. Given the uniqueness and plurality of the words, it would be of concern to understand how these words are shared in our everyday life. It is common world from where such plurality of words could be made possible, where everybody does participate and share. So, a linguistic ground makes it possible to reach out such projections on hard world. However, one cannot claim to share others' experience and attitudes. The knowledge of one's own word as well as others is always mediated by language. We do make linguistic agreements with others to have workable understanding in our everyday life. The main thrust of Wittgenstein's solipsism is that hard word remains independent of the self, which is metaphysically located outside it. The I shrinks to an extensionless point where one is left only with the word. As Barrett says, the word is unique in the sense of being all there is. Unquote. It is realism about the word arrived from the solipsistic position. Now, here it can be seen that solipsism, when its implications are followed out strictly, coincides with pure realism. The self of solipsism shrinks to a point without extension, and there remains the reality coordinated with it. Now, self is neither a thing in the world nor a subject of experience. Reality referred above is physical, having extension in space. Self is metaphysical, not referred to a human being with body. The coordination between the two is made possible only through the word being my word. The self is not essentially bound up with the mental phenomena. It has no location in a spatio-temporal world. Wittgenstein's solipsistic self seems to disappear from the world. It cannot be a part of the world, but is its is its presupposition. Its uniqueness lies in viewing it as the locus of transcendental position, the limits of the world. The monopoly of ego or the ownership of the self does not find any place in Wittgenstein's conception of solipsism. Now, metaphysical self eliminates the only subject of experience, me. It attains a point where it can be described as solipsism without a knowing subject, or solipsism without the solipsistic subject. Now, Wittgenstein remains a solipsist, but his position becomes peculiar in abolishing the ego. A self is metaphysically related with the world and manifests itself by seeing the word as my word. The word that is my word gets metaphysical status only within the framework set by the self. So, philosophy seeks to explore the transcendental character of self, which makes the world and life ethically meaningful. The philosophical self serves the purpose of human existence from the higher point of view. The purpose cannot be realized if self is entirely identified with its empirical existence in the world. Self is not in the world, rather with it, as Wittgenstein says. It is realization of self consciousness, where self becomes metaphysical with regards to higher order of life and the world. By viewing self as metaphysical, Wittgenstein meaningfully maintains status of moral values and supreme goal of human life as higher. The primacy of the higher can be established only by keeping the subject at the center. The subject, as a willing subject, gets located at the transcendental level and serves the purpose of human existence and its meaning. The transcendental moral will makes room for ethics. Will, as bearer of ethics, morally interacts with the world at metaphysical level, making the word ethically meaningful. When the word is seen as a limited whole, as my word, the willing subject finds a transcendental moral sphere to interact with the world. Without directly associating itself with the world, subject makes its appearance into the world. It brings a change only in the meaning or sense of the word. Such a change occurs with change in attitude of the subject at the metaphysical level, when the word is seen in its totality. It is not a matter of seeing any particular fact differently, but of seeing all the facts together. It is to be in agreement with the facts and accepting them with equanimity, seeing the word aright, as Wittgenstein says. The word appears ethically meaningful. Its boundaries change in accordance with the exercise of the will. My will penetrates the word, and that will is seen as good and evil. Wittgenstein says this in Tractatus. He further writes in Tractatus, hence the good or the bad exercise of the will would alter only the limits of the word, not the facts. Things in the word would acquire significance only through their relation with my will. Unquote. The transcendental turn of ethics indicates that ethics lies at the limits of the word and provides a view from the word as a limited whole. And so it is limited by the subject who values it. As Phil Strom, in his article on guilt writes, ethics is essentially about the subject's perspective or attitude to the world and life. A perspective constituting a condition or the possibility of the world as perspectively structured by the subject. The subject is itself at the limit of the world, views her, his, or its word as a whole under the aspect of ethical or aesthetic value. Unquote. So ethical value depends on subject's valuational act or attitudes, the way subject relates to the world around it. The willing subject determines the ethical status of the world. Therefore, happy man's world is different from an unhappy man's world. These are Wittgenstein's words. One makes the world good and the other makes it a hell. Although facts of the world in both cases remain same, but their attitude towards it makes their world so different. The subject which is bound within the limits of its own solipsistic world has to step out from the individualistic way of seeing the world and recognize facts of the world together with equanimity, whatever they may be. One could come into agreement with the facts of the world together by seeing them as a limited whole, which Wittgenstein identifies as thus mystical. When the mystical shows itself, one sees the world rightly. One knows how to live. We grasp the oneness of the world and the world. We grasp the oneness of the life and the world. It is the realization of the higher consciousness where there is no scope of looking at the empirical contents and identifying with them. Only in this sense, life becomes eternal and realizes its higher meaning, its value. So, ethics now originates from our deeply felt personal responses to life and the world. And this one can argue only from establishing this solipsistic position. They are not just social or intellectual constructs. It represents our desire to say something about the ultimate meaning of life. Ethics involves characterization or characterizing the world and our relationship to it as a whole. Since it is our personal responses which are to be characterized in this relationship, a transcendental subject is presupposed as being capable of viewing the world as a limited whole. Both the subject as well as the very characterization are beyond the word of fact and hence cannot satisfy the condition of language. Such proposition cannot have determinate sense and can be spoken of only in the first person. The fall they fall outside the domain of public realm of discourse. Now, about lecture on ethics, Wittgenstein wrote one place. He says, at the end of my lecture on ethics, I spoke in the first person. I think that this is something very essential. Here, there is nothing to be stated anymore. All I can do is to step forth as an individual and speak in the first person. Now, I will conclude by citing Wittgenstein's another letter where he writes to Russell. He says, I quote, I cannot write you anything about logic today. Perhaps you regard this thinking about myself as a waste of time. But how can I be a logician before I am a human being? Far the most important thing is to come to terms with myself. Now, my understanding is that speaking in the first person is to do with what Wittgenstein calls coming to terms with myself. And this is what the attempt which he found is more important one when he was writing Tractatus and which remained unwritten. And it can be approached only from the inside. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sirola. Now I invite Professor Pradhan to give his observation.
Uh, Thank you.